The worst thing about almost dying was how quiet it was. No screaming, no thunder, just the sound of her own boots against frozen ground, the whistle of wind cutting through the tree line, and the distant howl of something that had been following her for the last 2 hours. Alice kept walking. She had stopped being afraid of the dark sometime around the 14th mile. Fear was heavy, and she had too much else to carry. The satchel on her back held everything she had left in the world. 3 wool-wrapped bundles of dried silver leaf, a glass jar sealed with beeswax containing a poultice she had ground by hand the night before, 2 strips of linen bandage, a half-burned candle, and a folded letter she hadn't opened since the morning she'd found it tucked under the door of the cottage she no longer lived in. She hadn't read it again. She didn't need to. She had memorized every word the first time, including the part where her husband's handwriting changed midway through the second paragraph, as though someone else had finished the sentence for him. You were never meant to stay, Alice. Not here. Not with us. Us. That single word had cost her 3 days of silence, 2 sleepless nights, and 40 miles of road she was still walking. She adjusted the strap of the satchel and focused on breathing. The cold had settled deep into her lungs by now, and every inhale tasted like pine resin and frost. The forest on either side of the road was dense and black, the kind of black that swallowed sound, and she was grateful for it. Grateful that the trees didn't ask questions. Grateful that the wind didn't need an explanation. Alice had been walking since before dawn. She was 23 years old. She had no pack, no wolf, and no home to return to, and she was carrying medicine that no one had asked her to bring. That last part was the only thing keeping her upright. 3 months earlier, she had been a wife. Not a happy one. Not an unhappy one either, in the way that people usually meant. It had been something in between, something that looked fine from the outside and felt faintly hollow from within, like a loaf of bread baked with no salt. Caleb had been kind to her in the way that men were kind when they weren't paying attention. He smiled when she entered a room. He thanked her for meals. He never raised his voice. He simply wasn't there. Not truly. Not in the way that mattered. And Alice had spent 2 years of marriage quietly convincing herself that absence was not the same as cruelty. She'd been wrong about that. The Ashvale pack was his, not hers. She had come to it as an outsider, an omega from a dissolved family line, brought in as Caleb's mate because the match had been politically convenient, and because her late father had held territory that Caleb's alpha had wanted access to. She had known this, or suspected it, in the vague and careful way that women in her position learned to suspect things without allowing the suspicion to become something she would have to act on. She had managed her suspicion well for 2 years. Then she had found the letter, not addressed to her, addressed to Caleb, in a hand she recognized as belonging to Elder Horton, the pack's oldest council member, a man with pale eyes and a habit of standing just slightly too close to her at ceremonies. The letter had been folded inside a ledger Caleb kept in the lower drawer of his desk, the one he always locked. She had only found it because the lock had been left undone that morning, and she had been looking for a spare quill. She wished sometimes that she had needed no quill. The letter was short, precise, administrative in a way that made it more terrifying, not less. The deed transfer requires her signature before the next blood moon. If she will not sign willingly, there are other methods. The Whitmore healer has a compound that produces compliance without marks. It is better if it looks like illness. She is already considered fragile. No one will question it. Alice had stood very still for a long time after reading it. Then she had folded the letter back exactly as she had found it, placed it inside the ledger, and closed the drawer. She had gone to the kitchen. She had eaten her supper. She had said goodnight to Caleb as though nothing had shifted beneath her feet. And in the 3 days that followed, she had packed her satchel quietly, piece by piece, item by item, in between her ordinary tasks, so that no one would notice. She had taken nothing that belonged to the pack. Only the medicines she had made herself, the herbs she had grown in the narrow garden behind the cottage, and the linen shifts and wool cloak that had been hers before the marriage. She left before the moon rose on the third night. She did not leave a note. By the time the sky began to lighten into the pale gray that passed for dawn in late winter, Alice had reached the edge of Ashvale territory. She knew it by the smell. The pack's border carried a sharp, resinous marking, pine and iron and wolf musk. And when she crossed it, the scent dissolved into clean open air, and something in her chest unknotted by a fraction. She sat down on a fallen log and ate the last of the hard bread she had wrapped in cloth 2 days earlier. Her feet hurt. She had known they would. She took off her right boot and inspected the blister on her heel, which had broken sometime in the night and was now raw and weeping against the wool of her stocking. She rewrapped it with a strip of linen from her satchel, laced the boot back on, and stood. She had no destination. That was not entirely true. She had a destination, but it was not the kind that offered comfort. 40 miles north, past the Thornfield Road and through the Grey Crossing, there was a pack called Iron Hollow. She had heard of it the way you heard of things that lived at the edge of map and rumor. In low voices, with careful phrasing, with the particular tone that people used when they were describing something powerful enough to respect and distant enough to avoid. Iron Hollow was a war pack, old territory. The Alpha King who ruled it had no official name used openly in polite company, only a title, and the title was enough. But Alice had heard something else about Iron Hollow, something quieter and far more specific. There was a sickness spreading through its northern settlements, a sweating fever that the pack healers had failed to contain, that had already taken 2 elderly wolves and left a dozen others bedridden. She had heard this from a traveling merchant who had stopped at the Ashvale market 2 weeks before she left, and she had listened with the focused, practical attention she always gave to medical information, turning the symptoms over in her mind, cataloging them against what she knew. She knew what it was. She was almost certain. Greywood fever, rare, recurring, and devastating to shifted wolves, because it attacked the connection between human and wolf form, making it impossible to hold either cleanly, but treatable. If you knew the correct preparation. If you had dried silver leaf combined with ground marsh root steeped in cold water, not warm, and applied as both a poultice and a tea administered every 6 hours for 4 days. Alice had the silver leaf. She had the marsh root. She had the knowledge. What she did not have was any standing, any invitation, any name worth speaking, or any guarantee that the guards at the Iron Hollow border would let an unknown, packless Omega through the gate instead of turning her away in the snow. She walked anyway. By the 32nd mile, her hands had gone numb inside her gloves, and the sky had closed back down into gray. By the 36th, the wind had picked up enough to make the pines groan. By the 39th, she heard the howl again, closer now, and this time, there were 2 of them, and she understood, with the quiet clarity of someone too tired for panic, that Iron Hollow's sentinels had found her. She stopped walking. She stood very straight. She did not reach for anything in her satchel, because she was wise enough to know that reaching for anything at all would look like a threat, and she had no desire to look like a threat. She was a woman alone on a road in winter, carrying medicine and nothing else, and the only power she had was stillness. The wolves emerged from the tree line on both sides. They were large, Iron Hollow large, which was a different thing entirely from the wolves she had grown up around. Gray and black, heavy through the shoulders, with the particular light in their eyes that meant a trained guard, not a feral scout. Alice looked at the nearest one and said, with the steadiest voice she could manage, "I'm not armed. I'm a healer. I've walked from Ashvale territory with medicine for the Greywood fever. I'd like to speak to someone with authority, please." The wolves looked at each other. Then one of them shifted, bones folding with a sound that she had always found quietly astonishing. And a man stood in the snow where the gray wolf had been, already pulling a spare cloak from the ground where it had been bundled. He stared at her. You walked from Ashvale? He said. Yes. That's 40 miles. 42 approximately. He kept staring. Then he said something she wasn't expecting. The Alpha King is going to want to see you himself. Alice adjusted the strap of her satchel. Her heel was screaming inside her boot. Her lungs were burning with cold. That's fine, she said. I'll need hot water and a clean surface when we arrive. The Iron Hollow stronghold was nothing like what she had imagined. She had expected walls. She had not expected them to be that tall, that dark, or that silent. The stone was the color of charcoal, wet from recent rain, and it rose from the earth as though it had always been there, as though the forest had simply grown around something that had existed before the trees themselves. Torches burned in iron brackets along the outer gate, and the smell of them reached her before the walls did. Pine tar and burning tallow, sharp and clean against the cold. 2 guards stood at the entrance. Both shifted back to human form, both in dark leather and fur, both watching her with the particular expression of men who had been trained not to react, but were reacting anyway. She supposed she looked remarkable, in the way that drowned things sometimes did. The sentinel who had spoken to her in the road, a man who had introduced himself only as Wren, walked ahead of her through the gate without ceremony. She followed. The second wolf from the tree line had gone ahead, presumably to announce her, and she was aware of eyes tracking her from the interior walls as she entered the courtyard. It was a large space, cobblestoned, with a central well, and several low stone buildings clustered around a great hall that dominated the far end. Smoke rose from 3 separate chimneys. Somewhere deep inside the stronghold, someone was burning cedar wood, and the smell of it hit her with unexpected force, warm and quiet, and nothing like the cold she had been living in for 2 days. She breathed it in once, carefully, and kept walking. Wren brought her not to the great hall but to a smaller building on the left side of the courtyard, a low stone structure with a heavy door, and, inside, a long room with a stone floor, a table, 2 benches, and a fireplace that someone had already stoked into serious heat. A girl, no older than 16, stood near the fire with a basin of water and a folded cloth draped over her arm. She looked at Alice with wide, uncertain eyes. "Sit," Wren said, not unkindly. "Someone will come." He left without further explanation. Alice sat. She unslung her satchel with a care that made her shoulders ache, placed it on the table, and pressed both hands flat against the wood for a moment, feeling the grain of it, the solidity. The girl approached with the basin, and Alice allowed her hands to be cleaned without comment. The water was warm. The cloth smelled of lavender. Small, ordinary details, and she felt something in her chest respond to them with an intensity that embarrassed her. She was more exhausted than she had admitted to herself. She was unwrapping the silver leaf when the door opened. She had expected a steward, perhaps an elder, or a senior pack healer who had been sent to assess her claim before anyone of importance wasted their time on an unknown Omega from a dissolved bloodline. She had not expected the room to change. That was the only way she could describe it afterwards, in the private and carefully contained language she used for things she didn't fully understand. The room changed when he entered it. The temperature didn't drop. The light didn't shift. Nothing physical altered. But everything felt different. The way air felt different before a storm, charged with something that had weight and direction without being visible. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than the doorframe comfortably allowed, and he turned slightly as he entered. Not ducking, just adjusting, with the unconscious ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Dark hair pulled back in braided cords, a few of them falling loose against his jaw. Eyes the color of deep water, not blue exactly, something more complex, a color that light moved through differently depending on the angle. The leather across his chest was crossed with 2 straps that held nothing decorative, only functional buckles, worn and well kept. There was an old scar along his left forearm, faded to silver, and a newer one, thin and precise, along the line of his jaw. He was not what she had imagined an Alpha King would look like. She had imagined something louder. He looked at her the way a man looked at a map, thoroughly, without performance, taking information without yet offering interpretation. She held still under it. She was good at holding still. "You're the healer," he said. His voice was even, low, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to be heard. "I'm Alice," she said. "I'm not anyone's healer, officially. I walked from Ashvale with medicine for the Greywood fever. I believe I can help." Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A small recalibration. Ashvale is 40 miles south. 42 by the road I took. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the bench across from her and sat down, which surprised her. She had expected him to remain standing. Standing was how men like him usually conducted assessments, from above, from a position that required you to look up. He sat at the same level as her and folded his hands on the table, and she noticed that his knuckles were bruised, recent bruising. Whatever had occupied him before this conversation had not been pleasant. "Tell me what you have," he said. She told him. She spoke clearly, without padding, because she had learned long ago that clarity was the only currency an Omega without standing could spend. She described the symptoms she had heard reported, explained why she believed it was Greywood fever, and not the common lung sickness that had a similar presentation in early stages, outlined the preparation and the dosing schedule, and placed the wrapped bundles of silverleaf on the table between them as she spoke, along with the sealed jar of poultice. He listened without interrupting. He looked at the medicines, not at her, while she spoke, and she found that easier somehow. Being watched while she talked always made her choose her words more carefully than necessary, and she was too tired for careful. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Our healer said it was lung sickness," he said. "Your healer may be right. I may be wrong." She held his gaze. But Greywood fever and common lung sickness diverge in one specific way. Check whether the sick wolves are having difficulty holding their shift. If they are shifting partially without intending to, or if their wolf form feels distant or inaccessible to them, it's Greywood. If that symptom is absent, don't use my medicine. It won't harm them, but it won't help either. He looked at her then, directly, and the quality of attention in it was different from the assessment he had done when he walked in. That had been cataloging. This was something else. "How do you know Greywood fever?" he said. "My mother died of it," Alice said. "When I was 9. I spent 15 years trying to understand what killed her." The room was quiet except for the fire. He stood without ceremony and went to the door. He spoke briefly to someone outside, too low for her to catch the words, then returned and remained standing, one hand resting on the back of the bench. "You'll stay tonight," he said. It was not a question, but it also was not the kind of command she had learned to brace for. It had no edge. "The girl will bring food and show you a room. Tomorrow morning I'll take you to the sick ward myself." "I don't need a room," she said, and meant it as practical information rather than refusal. "I'll sleep on the bench if there's a fire. I've been sleeping colder than this for 2 nights. Something moved across his face. It was gone before she could name it. "You'll have a room," he said, and his voice hadn't changed, still even, still measured. But there was something underneath it now that she didn't have the energy to examine. "With a lock if you want one." She blinked. No one had offered her a lock before, not in 2 years of marriage to a man who had apparently been planning to drug her into signing away what remained of her father's land. "Yes," she said, after a pause that was one breath too long. "Thank you." He nodded once, the way men nodded when they were concluding things, and moved toward the door. Then he stopped. His back was to her. "Alice," he said. Yes. What made you leave Ashvale? She considered lying. She considered a partial truth. She considered saying nothing in the particular tone that closed conversations. Instead, what came out was quieter than any of those options. I found out what I was worth to them, she said. And it wasn't much. He didn't turn around, but she saw the muscles along his shoulders shift, a small, contained movement, like something tightening and being deliberately released. Then he walked out, and the door closed behind him, and the fire crackled on, and Alice sat alone in a warm room in a stronghold that was not hers, surrounded by medicines that might save people she had never met, thinking about a letter she still hadn't thrown away. She reached into the inner pocket of her cloak and pressed her fingers against the folded edge of it. She had carried it 42 miles without knowing why. She was beginning, distantly, to understand that she had needed proof. Not for anyone else. For herself. Proof that it had been real. That she had not imagined the threat. That the ground really had dissolved under her feet, and that she had walked anyway, and that she was still here. The girl returned with a bowl of broth, dark and thick with herbs, and a heel of bread still warm from the oven. Alice ate every bite. The sick ward was in the eastern wing of the stronghold, behind a heavy door that smelled of camphor, and something underneath it, something organic and wrong, the particular scent of a body fighting itself from the inside. Alice smelled it before she saw anything, and knew immediately that she had been right. Greywood fever had a signature that no other illness carried. Beneath the sweat and the heat of a high temperature, there was something almost metallic, like rain on iron, mixed with the faint sweetness of decaying pine resin. It was the smell of a wolf losing its grip on itself. She had first encountered it as a child, standing outside her mother's door, pressing her face into the wood and breathing in what she didn't yet have words to describe. She had words for it now. She wished she didn't. Aidan walked beside her through the corridor. He had come to her door himself at first light, which had surprised her, and he had said only the ward is ready before turning to lead the way, apparently trusting that she would follow. She had followed. She had also, in the brief privacy of that morning, splashed cold water on her face, rebraided her hair, and reminded herself with some firmness that this was a working visit, that she was here for the sick, and that the warm meal and the locked room and the way he had said you'll have a room in that particular voice were not things she needed to be thinking about. She was thinking about them anyway, in the background, behind everything else. The way a candle left burning in another room made itself known without being looked at directly. She stopped thinking about them when she entered the ward. There were 11 people in various states of distress spread across low pallets arranged along both walls. Most were adults, 2 of them elderly, their skin the waxy yellow-gray of a fever that had been burning for too long. A woman in her middle years was half-shifted in her sleep, one hand formed into a partial claw that she clearly couldn't release, her face twisted with the effort of a body caught between 2 forms. A young man near the door was shaking so hard his teeth clicked audibly, 2 blankets over him, and still shivering as though no warmth could find him. Alice set her satchel on the central table and began. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, without hesitation, speaking only when she needed information. She asked the pack healer, a woman named Sora with sharp eyes and an expression of carefully maintained neutrality, about the progression of each patient's symptoms. How many days, what treatments had been attempted, whether the partial shifting was present across all cases or only some. It was present in 9 of the 11. The remaining 2 had a different symptom pattern, and she told Sora honestly that those 2 might indeed be lung sickness, a separate outbreak running concurrently, and that they should be kept apart from the Greywood cases. Sora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had that thought myself, 3 days ago. The Elder Council told me I was wrong." Alice looked at her. "You weren't wrong." Something shifted in Sora's expression. Not gratitude exactly. Recognition, perhaps, the way one person recognized another who had been overruled by people with more authority and less knowledge. They worked together after that without friction. Aiden did not leave. She had expected him to. Most men of authority, in her experience, delegated and departed. They appeared for the beginning of things and the end of things, and the middle, the actual labor, was handled by other people while the authority stood elsewhere, thinking about other authority. He remained near the door, arms crossed, watching. He asked no unnecessary questions. When she needed water boiled, he sent for it without being asked twice. When the elderly man near the far wall began to deteriorate mid-afternoon, slipping from restless sleep into something deeper and more alarming, Aiden was across the room before she was, one large hand resting on the man's chest, speaking in a low voice she couldn't quite hear. Something steady and anchoring, and the man's breathing, impossibly, slowed and evened. She stared. She hadn't known that alpha presence could do that. Not literally. Not with sick wolves. She had heard of it theoretically. The calming effect of an alpha's proximity on distressed pack members. But she had never seen it demonstrated so plainly and so quietly. Caleb had never done anything like it. Caleb had barely touched anyone unless required. Aiden caught her staring and said nothing. She looked back at her work. By late afternoon, she had administered the first round of the silverleaf preparation to all 9 confirmed Greywood cases. The poultice was applied to the pulse points at wrist and throat, where the fever ran highest, and the tea was coaxed into those who were conscious enough to swallow. She had enough supplies for 4 days of treatment. Enough, if her calculations were right, to bring them through the worst of it. Sora watched the dosing with the careful attention of someone memorizing a new method, and Alice narrated as she worked, not performing knowledge but genuinely sharing it, because the point was not to be the only person who could do this. The point was for it to be done. When the last patient was settled, Alice straightened up from a crouch that had lasted too long and felt her lower back register a formal complaint. She pressed one hand to it and exhaled. "You should eat," Aiden said, from somewhere behind her and closer than she expected. She turned. He was standing perhaps 4 feet away, and in the lower light of the ward's torches, the shadows caught differently on his face, the line of his jaw, the old scar. He looked tired. She realized with a small start that he had been here all day too. "So should you," she said. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more of a shift in the set of his mouth that implied the possibility of one, like a door opened an inch. She filed it away without meaning to. They ate in a small anteroom off the great hall, just the 2 of them, and a table that held bread, cold roasted meat, a dish of preserved plums, and a jug of something warm that turned out to be spiced cider rather than wine, which she appreciated because she couldn't afford the loosening that wine produced. Not yet, not here. They ate mostly in silence, which she also appreciated. She had grown so accustomed to performing contentment at meals, to filling the quiet with small observations and careful conversation, that real silence felt startling and oddly restful. He refilled her cup without asking, which she noticed. After a while, he said, "How did you learn the Greywood preparation? You said your mother died of it." "She did," Alice said. "I didn't know what it was for a long time. When I was old enough to read, I started going through my father's medical records. He'd kept everything. Notes from every healer he'd consulted, treatments attempted, dosing schedules. I cross-referenced them with a text I found later, an old pack healer's journal from about 100 years ago. The silverleaf compound was mentioned in passing. The healer who wrote it called it insufficient against fever and moved on. She paused. He was administering it warm. That was the error. Heat breaks down the active compound. The whole preparation has to be cold. Aiden was watching her. "So you figured it out from a footnote," he said. from a footnote and 15 years of not being able to sleep. She heard the edge in her own voice and softened it deliberately. "I'm sorry." That sounded self-pitying. "It sounded true," he said. She looked at him. He was not performing sympathy. He was simply stating what he had observed, and the plainness of it was more unsettling than comfort would have been. Because she could dismiss comfort. She had done it many times, but she didn't know what to do with someone who just looked at her and told her what was true. She looked at her cup. "The letter you mentioned," he said, and she went very still. "The reason you left Ashvale." "I didn't mention a letter specifically," she said. "No, but you said you found out what you were worth to them." His voice was careful, not pressing, not retreating. That's the kind of knowledge that usually has a source. She considered the table surface, the grain of the wood, the small imperfection where a knot had been filled and sanded. "My husband and one of his elders were planning to have me drugged and made to sign a land transfer. My father's territory. The last thing remaining of his name." She said it simply, the same way she had said everything else, because if she changed her tone for it, she would feel the size of it. They'd apparently decided I was fragile enough that no one would question an illness. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. "His name?" Aiden said. "It doesn't matter." "It does to me." She looked up. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen there yet, something still and cold that had nothing to do with indifference. She understood it, in her body if not yet in her mind, as a kind of contained fury, the kind that men who had real power didn't need to raise their voices to express. "Caleb Varn," she said. "Ashvale Pack, mid-rank alpha." Aiden said nothing. He reached for his cup and drank slowly, and she watched the deliberate steadiness of the motion, and understood that he was choosing, consciously, not to say whatever had come to mind first. That restraint frightened her more than rage would have. She had grown up around rage. She knew how to navigate it, how to go still and quiet and wait for it to pass. She did not know what to do with a man who kept his power behind his teeth on purpose. "You're safe here," he said at last. "You don't know me," she said immediately, not rudely, just honestly. "You have no reason to make that promise. I know you walked 42 miles in winter carrying medicine for strangers," he said. "And I know what you have in your inner cloak pocket that you touch when you think no one is watching." Her hand had moved without her permission, pressing against the letter's edge through the wool. She pulled it back. "That's not knowledge," she said. "That's observation. Sometimes they're the same thing." She didn't answer. The fire in the small grate between them burned low, and outside, the wind had picked up, throwing itself against the stone walls of the stronghold, and she sat in the warmth of it and tried to remember the last time she had felt, even briefly, that something around her was solid. She couldn't find the memory, but something in the room was telling her she was close to one. She was afraid of that. She made a private note to stay afraid of it. Staying afraid had kept her alive this far. She stayed 4 days. That had been the plan. 4 days of treatment, 1 round of medicine every 6 hours, and then the patients would be through the worst of it, and she would leave. She had said this clearly on the first morning, not as negotiation but as information, the way she said most things. 4 days. She had nowhere to go after that, but she hadn't said that part. By the 3rd day, 8 of the 9 Greywood cases were showing improvement. The partial shifting had stopped in 6 of them. The elderly man who had been closest to the edge was sitting up, eating broth, and had asked Sora with mild indignation why his blanket smelled like pine needles. Sora had told him it was medicine, and he had said it smelled like a forest floor, and Sora had said yes. That's rather the point, and Alice had heard this from across the ward and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since the morning she had found the letter. The 9th case was harder. The woman who had been half-shifted in her sleep whose name was Mara, was in her late 40s, and she had been carrying the fever for longer than anyone else before Alice arrived. The connection between her human and wolf form had been strained past the point where 4 days of Silverleaf could fully repair it. She was improving, the fever was breaking, but the partial shift persisted, her left hand still caught between forms, the bones unwilling to settle fully in either direction. Alice sat with her on the third night. Not because it was medically necessary. She had administered the final dose. There was nothing more the medicine could do until the body decided to do the rest. She sat because Mara was frightened. She could see it in the woman's eyes. The particular fear of someone who didn't know which version of herself she would wake up as. And Alice understood that fear in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't spent years feeling like they existed in 2 states at once without fully belonging to either. She didn't say any of that. She sat in the chair beside the pallet and talked quietly about herbs. Which ones grew in shade versus full light? Which ones lost potency if dried too fast? The difference between wild silverleaf and cultivated silverleaf, and why the wild variety worked better for greywood specifically. Something about the mineral content of uncultivated soil. Mara didn't understand most of it, and didn't need to. She just needed a voice in the dark that wasn't afraid. Around the 3rd hour of the night, Mara's hand shifted back completely. The woman made a sound like a sob, and pressed both hands to her face, and shook for a long time. Alice stayed where she was, and did not look away, and did not offer empty comfort. She simply stayed until the shaking stopped. When she finally rose to leave, she turned and found Aiden standing in the doorway. He had been there long enough that the torchlight had settled around him like it was accustomed to his presence. His arms were not crossed, his hands were at his sides, and his face held the same quality it usually did, that layered, considered stillness. But something in it was softer than it had been, and she felt it land somewhere she hadn't been expecting. She walked past him into the corridor without speaking. He fell into step beside her. They walked back through the stronghold in silence, which was becoming, she realized, their primary language. At the point where the corridor split toward her room, she stopped. "She's going to be all right," Alice said. "The bond between forms needs more time, but it will repair. Her body knows how to do it. It just needed the fever cleared first." "I know," he said. "I wasn't worried about Mara." She looked at him. "You've been awake since before the 2nd bell," he said. Not accusatory, just the same plain observation he always offered. "You're running on very little." "I'm fine." "You're not," he said, "but you're functional, which is clearly what you accept as fine." She opened her mouth and then closed it, because she didn't have an argument for that. It was, with uncomfortable precision, accurate. "Sleep," he said. "Tomorrow is the last day of treatment. After that—" He paused, and she noticed the pause, the slight recalibration before he continued. "After that, we should talk." "About what?" He looked at her steadily. "About what comes next for you." She felt the inside of her chest do something complicated and inconvenient. "I told you at the beginning," she said. "I don't need anything from Iron Hollow beyond the 4 days." "I know what you told me," he said. "I also know that you have nowhere to go, and that the people you left are dangerous, and that the deed to your father's territory is still unsigned, and therefore still contested." He said it without drama, like a man reading a map aloud, identifying features without editorializing. "Those are facts. We can talk about what to do with them, or you can walk away from this stronghold in the morning and carry them alone. Either way is your choice." She stared at him. "How do you know the deed is contested?" she said. Something moved in his expression. "Because 2 days ago I sent a rider to verify the legal status of the Varn holdings at Ashvale. Your father's territory is listed as a pending transfer, unsigned, under dispute. The paperwork has been held at the regional council for 3 months. He paused. They were waiting for your signature or your death. The corridor was very cold and very still. "You sent a writer," she said slowly, "to investigate my husband's land dealings." "Yes, without telling me. I told you I wanted to know his name. I meant it." She should have been angry. Part of her was, a flicker of it, the part that didn't like being investigated without consent. But underneath the flicker was something much more complex. The sensation of a door she had been leaning against for a very long time, suddenly having something lean back. "That land is mine," she said. The words came out rougher than she intended, carrying more weight than she had meant to let show. "My father built it. He left it to me. It's the last thing with his name on it, and they were going to take it with a forged signature and call it illness." "I know," Aiden said. "I want it back. I know that too." She looked at him for a long moment, and he held the look without flinching, without softening it into something easier. Just held it the way he held everything, with that infuriating, steadying patience. "What would it cost me?" she said. "Your help." "Nothing." "That's not an answer. Everything costs something." "Then call it a debt I'm choosing to carry," he said. "You walked 42 miles through winter to save people in my pack who you had never met and had no obligation to. That is not nothing, Alice. That has weight." She turned away before her face could do something she hadn't authorized. On the 4th morning, she completed the final round of treatment. All 9 patients were stable. The 2 with lung sickness had responded to Sora's standard treatment and were nearly recovered. Mara was fully shifted back for the first time in weeks, sitting up in human form with color in her cheeks, eating actual food, and complaining about the texture of the bread, which Sora told Alice privately was an excellent sign. Alice repacked her satchel. She had used nearly everything. Only a small bundle of dried silver leaf remained, and she left half of it with Sora, along with written instructions for the preparation. Cold water, the dosing schedule, the proportions. Sora took the notes with both hands and held them carefully. "You didn't have to write this down," Sora said. "I know," Alice said. "But my mother's healer didn't write it down, and it cost her life. So." Sora was quiet. Then she said, "Will you stay?" Alice didn't answer immediately. She had been asking herself the same question since the 3rd night, when she had turned and found Aiden in the doorway and felt something shift inside her that she hadn't chosen and didn't entirely trust. She had spent 2 years learning the cost of staying in the wrong place with the wrong people, and the lesson had been thorough. The fact that this place was warm and this man was not Caleb were not by themselves sufficient reasons to lower her guard. But the deed was contested. Her father's name was still in dispute, and she had no shelter, no pack, no standing, and winter was not close to finished. These were practical considerations. She told herself they were practical considerations. She found Aiden in the great hall, standing over a wide table covered in maps, 2 senior pack members on either side of him, and a third across, mid-discussion. She stopped at the edge of the room. He looked up immediately, as though he had sensed her before she spoke, and something in the quality of his attention shifted the way it always did, narrowed and focused, and she still hadn't learned how to be entirely comfortable with that. "I need to speak with you," she said, "when you have a moment." "Now," he said, without looking at the men around the table. They took the word as dismissal and moved away without comment. She walked to the table. The maps were of the Northern Territories, and she recognized the Ashvale markings in the lower quadrant, the small, stylized wolf's head that had been her husband's pack seal for as long as she could remember. She pointed to the mark. "That's them." "Yes." "What would legal reclamation of the territory require?" He was watching her. "A formal challenge to the pending transfer, filed by the rightful heir in front of the regional council. It requires the heir to be present, to be alive, and to provide evidence that the pending signature was obtained or attempted under duress." "The letter," she said. "I still have it." "The letter would be sufficient," he said, "with a witness. I don't have witnesses. You would have mine," he said. "And the full testimony of the Iron Hollow Alpha King carries legal weight in every regional council from here to the Eastern Ridge." She stared at the map, at the small wolf's head that had never truly been hers, at the territory her father had built with 30 years of work, and she had nearly lost to a man who had called her fragile in writing and meant it as a strategy. "If I do this," she said quietly, "Caleb will know where I am." "Yes, that doesn't concern you." "It concerns me considerably," he said, "which is why it won't be you who goes to the council alone." He paused. "I'll take you myself, with a guard detail that will make the nature of my position in this very clear to anyone who wants to contest it." She looked up at him. The morning light through the high window behind him caught the gray in his braids, and he looked, standing there over the maps with his hands braced on the edge of the table, like something very old and very certain. And she felt, despite every careful intention, the distinct and inconvenient sensation of wanting to trust him. She did not trust the sensation, but she noted it, filed it away. "I want my father's name," she said. "I want the land registered in my own right, not as someone's wife, in my name alone." "That's what we'll file for," he said. "And if it doesn't work?" He looked at her steadily. "It will work. You can't promise, Alice." Her name in his mouth, quiet and direct. "It will work." She breathed in. Cedar smoke from the hall's fireplace. Cold stone, the faint trace of silver leaf still on her own hands. "All right," she said. It came out smaller than she intended. He heard it anyway. The regional council convened in a town called Grayford, 3 days' ride from Iron Hollow, in a building that smelled of old paper and beeswax candles and the particular mustiness of authority that had sat in the same rooms for too long. Alice had been there once before, as a child, standing beside her father while he filed a boundary extension, too young to understand the proceedings, but old enough to remember his hand on her shoulder and the way he had spoken to the clerks, precisely, without apology, like a man who knew the weight of his own name. She had not felt that weight in a long time. She felt it now. She rode in the second carriage of a 6-carriage convoy, beside Sora, who had insisted on coming, and whom Alice had not argued with, because she was learning, slowly, the difference between refusing help out of principle and refusing it out of habit. Aiden rode ahead on a dark horse, in full Iron Hollow regalia. The black fur mantle and the leather chest piece with the pack seal pressed in silver, and the effect of it on the towns they passed through was something she watched with quiet attention. People stopped. People straightened. People moved aside not from fear, but from the instinctive deference that genuine authority produced, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Caleb had announced himself constantly. She had not understood, until now, how much noise insecurity made. The council chamber held 12 seated members and a standing gallery. When Aiden entered, all 12 rose without being asked. He acknowledged it with a single nod and took the witness position to Alice's left, standing rather than seated, which she understood was deliberate. He was not a petitioner here. He was a presence. Alice stood at the central floor with the letter in her hands. Elder Horton was there. She had not expected him to be there, and for a brief, terrible moment when she saw his pale eyes across the chamber, she felt the ground try to shift beneath her feet, the way it had the morning she had read his words. She is already considered fragile. No one will question it. She stood very straight. She placed the letter on the council table. She placed beside it a second document, a sworn account she had written herself in her clearest hand, detailing the timeline from finding the letter to leaving Ashvale to the 42 miles north. She had written it 3 nights ago in the room with the lock, by candlelight, and the writing of it had felt like something being taken out of her body, and set down somewhere outside of her, something that had been pressing against her ribs for weeks, finally given a place to exist that wasn't inside her chest. She stated her name. She stated her father's name. She stated the nature of her claim. Then she read the letter aloud. The chamber was very quiet when she finished. One of the council members, a woman with iron-gray hair and an expression that had clearly survived several decades of men trying to manage her, looked at Elder Horton and said, "Is this your hand?" Horton said, "The document is fabricated." Alice had expected this. She had prepared for this. She did not flinch. The ink compound in that letter matches the personal blend registered to Elder Horton's household at the time of the document's dating, Aiden said, from her left, in a voice that did not require the room to be quiet, but made it so anyway. "I had it verified by an independent document examiner in Grayford 3 days ago. The results are attached to the filing." He placed a third document on the table. The gray-haired council member picked it up, read it, set it down. "Elder Horton," she said, and the way she said his name had no more warmth in it than a stone floor in January. What followed was not swift. Legal proceedings were never swift, and Alice had not expected them to be. There were 2 hours of testimony, questions, counter-arguments from a representative that Caleb had apparently sent ahead, a thin man in a good coat, who spoke in the practiced tones of someone paid to make bad things sound like misunderstandings. Alice answered every question. She did not elaborate beyond what was asked. She did not perform distress. She had spent too many years managing other people's comfort with her emotions to perform them for an audience now. At one point, the representative suggested that the letter could be interpreted as a reference to a legal medical consultation rather than a conspiracy. Alice looked at him. "The letter specifies a compound that produces compliance without marks, so that no signs of coercion would be visible on the body. Please explain how that is a routine medical consultation." The representative did not explain. When the council retired to deliberate, Alice sat in the antechamber on a wooden bench and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. Sora sat beside her without speaking. After a while, Aiden came and stood near the window across from her, looking out at the gray afternoon sky, and she was grateful that he did not try to reassure her, because reassurance would have cracked something she needed to keep sealed until this was finished. The deliberation took 40 minutes. The transfer was voided. The territory was registered in Alice's name, as sole heir of her father's estate, with no spousal claim attached. Elder Horton was suspended from council pending a formal investigation. Caleb Varn was served a notice of legal misconduct and would face his own proceedings before the regional authority within the month. The gray-haired council member, whose name Alice learned was Councillor Dresch, handed her the registration document personally. "Your father was a good man," Dresch said quietly. "I knew him. He would have been proud of how you conducted yourself today." Alice took the document with both hands. She didn't cry. Not then. Not in that room. She waited until the carriage had pulled out of Grayford and the town had disappeared behind the tree line, and then she pressed the registration to her chest and let herself feel, for exactly 1 breath, the full size of what had just been given back to her. 1 breath. Then she folded the document carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of her cloak, where the letter used to live. The letter was on the council table now, sealed into evidence. She had left it there without hesitation. She didn't need proof anymore. She had something better. The ride back to Iron Hollow took 3 days, and on the second evening, they stopped at a wayhouse with low ceilings and a fire large enough to heat the whole main room. The convoy's guards filled most of the long table, and there was roasted meat and dark bread and a sharp local cider that made her eyes water pleasantly, and at some point in the middle of the meal, someone produced a worn instrument and began to play something slow and without particular ambition, and the room settled into the loose, easy warmth of people who had done a hard thing and were resting on the other side of it. Aiden sat beside her, not across, beside. It was the first time in all the days since she had arrived at his gate that he had chosen a position that close, and she was aware of it the way she was aware of most things he did, with that careful, involuntary attention that she had stopped pretending was purely practical. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it genuinely. "Like something that was very heavy has been set down," she said. "And I'm not sure yet what my hands are for, now that they're empty." He was quiet for a moment. "They'll find something worth carrying," he said. She looked at him sidelong. The firelight was doing something particular to the planes of his face, and he was looking at the middle distance with that habitual steadiness. And she thought about the corridor outside the sick ward, and the letter she had carried 42 miles, and the way he had said it will work as though certainty was something he could simply choose to offer. "Aiden," she said. He turned to look at her. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. Not as an apology, as information, the way she said everything. "I have a piece of land and no pack and no particular plan beyond the next fortnight. I'm not—" She paused. "I'm not easy. I've been told that. I ask too many questions, and I don't trust quickly, and I've been wrong about people in ways that cost me." "I know," he said. "I'm not finished." He waited. "I'm also not fragile," she said. "Whatever that letter said, whatever they believed, that was never true." "I know that too," he said. "I knew it when you walked through my gate with 42 miles on your boots, and medicine for strangers, and your chin up like the cold was a personal insult." Something in her chest did the complicated, inconvenient thing again, larger this time. "What do you want from me?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. He looked at her for a long moment with that deep water gaze. "Nothing you're not ready to give," he said. "I want you to stay at Iron Hollow as long as you need. I want you to work with Sora if you want to. I want you to have a room with a lock and use it or not as you choose." He paused. "And I want, eventually, when you're ready and not before, to know if what I feel when I look at you is something you feel too." The instrument by the fire played on. Someone laughed at the far end of the table. "And if I'm not ready for a long time," she said. "Then I'll be there for a long time," he said simply. She looked at the fire. She thought about her mother and her father, and the deed with her name alone on it. She thought about the 42 miles and the cold, and the letter she had carried as proof and no longer needed. She thought about a room with a lock that she had chosen, most nights, not to use. "I think," she said carefully, "that I feel it too. I'm just not certain of it yet." "Certain takes time," he said. "I have time." Spring came late to Iron Hollow, but it came. The sick ward emptied completely by the end of the first month. Mara brought Alice 3 jars of preserved honey and a hand-woven cloth as thanks, and refused to accept any demurral. Sora and Alice fell into a working rhythm that neither of them had planned, complementary and uncompetitive, and the pack's medical knowledge grew in ways that quietly changed outcomes for the better. 2 more cases of Greywood fever came through in early spring from neighboring territories, referred specifically to Iron Hollow, because word had traveled, as word did, about the Omega healer who had walked 42 miles and cured what others couldn't. Alice treated them both. Then she wrote up a full account of the silverleaf preparation, and sent copies to 6 regional healers she trusted, through Aiden's courier network, with no name on the document. Just the method, just the cold water, and the proportions, and the 6-hour schedule. The knowledge, freed from the person who carried it, doing what knowledge was meant to do. Her father's territory was formally transferred into her management by late spring. She appointed a steward, a steady older woman named Pell, who had managed estates for 30 years and had no patience for anyone who tried to explain things she already knew. The land would be tended. Her father's name would hold. Caleb's proceedings ended with censure and a significant financial penalty. He lost his rank within the Ashvale Council. Alice heard this from Aiden, who told her plainly and without embellishment, and she sat with the news for a while, and found that it felt less like victory than like a door closing quietly on something that no longer needed her attention. Elder Horton was removed from council permanently. She did not ask for more than that. Justice had dimensions, and she was learning to let some of them belong to the process, and not to her. It was a night in late spring when she finally told him. They were in the library, which had become one of her places, all dark wood and tall shelves and the smell of old leather and candle smoke. And she had been reading, and he had been at the other end of the room doing something with documents, and the fire between them was burning low. She put her book down. "I'm certain now," she said. He looked up. She held his gaze across the room, across the fire, across all the weeks of careful distance she had needed, and he had honored without complaint. "I'm certain," she said again. He set the documents down and came to her, unhurried, and sat beside her on the bench, and took her hand with a gentleness that was not softness but choice, the deliberate choice of a man who knew his own strength and had decided exactly how much of it to use. She leaned into him, just slightly, just enough to feel the warmth of him and the solidity, and something she had been holding braced for a very long time finally released. They stayed like that while the fire burned down. Outside, the spring wind moved through the iron hollow pines, carrying the scent of thaw and new earth and everything that came after surviving the cold. The stronghold was quiet. The ward was empty. The deed with her name on it was in the room upstairs. There was nothing left unfinished, nothing left undone. Alice closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, she had no desire to be anywhere else.